Okay, folks, so good evening and welcome to Sacred Dance with Trance. And this evening, or today, depending on which part of the world and when you are currently listening to this, I have our special guest is Leslie Kean. Leslie Kean is New York Times bestselling author of her book UFOs, Generals, Pilots and Government Officials Go on the Record. That was released in 2010. And she's an independent investigative journalist. She's been publishing widely in dozens of newspapers, magazines, both in the USA and in other territories of the world as well, such as, but also Boston Globe, The Nation, The Globe, The Mail, and the International Herald Tribune, and currently contributes articles to the Huffington Post. Leslie is also the co-author of Burma's Revolution of the Spirit, and she lives in New York. And I believe that's where you'll be speaking from us today, Leslie. Leslie, can I welcome you to Sacred Dance with Trance? It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Hi, Warren. Great to be on with you. And yes, I am in New York.
Wonderful. And how is life in New York today?
Well, I love New York. We don't have any snow today, but I know you do, so.
It's tipping it down with snow. Typical, I'd like to say typical English weather, but that's usually rain. But today the rain has frozen over.
Right. Well, no, things are good here.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm pleased to hear it. And this is for those watching on, this is my second interview following on from Suzanne Temple last week. And today it's Leslie Kean. And it is a pleasure to have you here, Leslie. I've met Leslie probably a couple of times now at various seminars here in the UK, where physical mediumship and trance mediumship was demonstrated to a wonderful degree. And I also had the pleasure of seeing Leslie present her presentation not only on UFOs, the best-selling book, but also on Surviving Death, which was your book. Now, I'm just going to show listeners both your book, viewers your book, and also the audio book, which are just here. And Leslie's just made me aware that this book is now out in paperback. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, it just came out about 2 weeks ago.
Wonderful. And having read it, first of all and foremost, for those of you who are interested in surviving death, the subject of mediumship, the evidence of survival, the scientific journalistic side, where things have to be paramount and accurate and are not taken on hearsay so much, they're taken on facts. This is the information to read. So it is a pleasure to have Leslie with us for that very reason, because over the last couple of years, she has become, I think it's safe to say you've become certainly someone that a lot of people in the media are now going to discuss such matters in both fields of UFO and surviving death. What I would like to ask you, though, is from a journalist's point of view, could you tell us a little bit about your journalistic career, just to give our viewers an idea of the work that you have done?
Sure. I learned journalism by being mentored, really, by a prize-winning journalist who I worked with in the 1990s. And this was after I had made a trip to Burma as a human rights activist. So I was very interested in the struggle for democracy that was going on in Burma. When I came back, I was invited to go on some radio shows. It was when I was living in California, to talk about that. And in the process of that, I got to know a journalist who worked at this radio station where I'd been interviewed, and he recognized the fact that I had some very unusual, kind of groundbreaking material that I had acquired when I was in Burma. And so we started writing articles together. He was an accomplished journalist. I'd never published anything before, although I had co-authored a book on Burma, but I'd never done any journalism. And so the short story is that we started publishing these articles together, and through that process, I learned what journalism was all about by working with this person. I didn't have any formal training in it, but I thought this was the best training I could ever get, because it was very hands-on. I just learned by doing. And in those days, you could publish freelance articles in lots of places in America. You can't anymore, but a lot of newspapers and magazines were open, and this person I was working with had connections in all these places because he had published before. So we did a whole series of articles, and they got a lot of attention internationally, nationally. I did a cover story for a magazine in New York, and And that's how I learned journalism, basically. And then I ended up working at the radio station. It was called KPFA Radio in the Bay Area in California, and I ended up getting a job there working on the very show that this journalist produced there. And it was a daily investigative news program. So through that, I learned a lot about broadcast journalism as well, because this was every day we had to cover stories for an hour on a live broadcast. So I learned how to do interviews, and I learned just everything you need to know about journalism and how to cover information, and what's important and what's not important, and how you have to show the accuracy of things, and things have to be corroborated, and how to draw people out when you're doing interviews and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So so in terms of, but that was very, I was studying kind of left oriented issues such as human rights, reporting on a lot of different things, social justice issues and things like that. And then I received this report from a colleague in France on UFOs all of a sudden. I mean, I was interested in UFOs. I'd read some books about it, but interested in UFOs like I was a lot of things. But I was very open-minded, and this colleague sent me this report about UFOs that had come out of France, written by generals and admirals and very, very high-level people in the military in France in cooperation with a bunch of scientists who had studied all these UFO cases, official cases, and spent years and years investigating them, and came to the conclusion that they thought the best hypothesis to explain these cases was what they call the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And that basically meant that they were saying, and again, there were 4 generals involved with this study. They were saying that they thought it was very likely that these were objects visiting us from other worlds. And I was absolutely astonished by this. And I thought, this is huge. This is a huge story. Oh my God. Imagine if American generals ever said that, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, it was just, to me, it was just mind-blowing. And it was a 90-page thing, and it had been translated in English, and nobody had it yet except me.
Wow.
And so I thought, my God, I've got this hot story. So then I ended up writing a story for the Boston Globe, which is a big newspaper in America, based on that report. And I think it was the first story I had written on my own, not in cooperation with my colleague. And to me, it was absolutely a big deal. It got a lot of attention, but it didn't change the landscape at all in terms of the problems that we have with people in denial about the importance of this issue. But that's just to give you a nutshell sketch of how that all started for me, was through that report. And after I did that story, and I was very nervous to even tell my colleagues before I published it that I was even interested in this, and that there's such a stigma around the subject. It was worse then than it is now. So that was in like the late 90s, 1998, 99. My story came out in 2000. And ever since then, I gradually shifted to become fully focused on the UFO investigation, and eventually ended up leaving the radio station and just taking on that investigation full time, and did a lot of different things around the UFO issue, but they were all journalistic. I mean, I published a lot of stories in different places in America, organized press conferences, was a plaintiff in a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against NASA on a UFO case. And they all culminated in the book that you mentioned that I wrote in 2010. But that was after spending about a decade of work as a journalist working on the UFO issue. And I was also, during that time, very interested in the question of survival of consciousness and survival past death. And although I didn't do anything with it professionally, I was sort of poking around on the background. At one point, I was invited to be a producer on a documentary about it that a friend was making, and I ended up going to the UK and did some interviews with some of the people from the Skoll group.
Okay.
The two of the Alan and Diana Bennett, who were 2 of the mediums involved with that. Was fascinated by that. Went to some conferences where there's a lot of mediumship discussed, and the Skoll people were there and other people were there. So I was very curious about that as well, and started to learn a lot of different things about it, very interested in reincarnation. And then once the UFO book came out, and there's a couple of years afterwards where I was still very involved with it, my publisher came and said, do you want to write a book about something else? And surviving death was the natural topic that I said, yes, I want to do this. And I was so happy to have that opportunity, because it's something I'd always been interested in, but never really been able to deeply focus on, because I've been so busy with UFOs. So I guess, I'm interested in sort of these big questions that don't really have answers. But I'm very interested in applying a kind of a journalistic approach, which isn't the way most people approach these things. They're either believers, or they're skeptics, or they're experiencers, or whatever. But I'm interested in trying to bring these mysteries to people who have had no experience with them, who don't think about them very often, and try to sort of break through the barriers that exist in the culture, which means reaching people who aren't like you and like me, who have a natural affinity for it, a natural acceptance of it. I'm trying to sort of change the status quo in a sense. So that's why the way to do that is to give solid data and appeal to people's intellects to make them think about it. And that's the approach I've taken, because that's what my particular gift is. That's how I've been trained and everything. And I enjoy doing that. And I enjoy providing information also that skeptics cannot argue with. I mean, there's information in this book. You can interpret it however you want in my Surviving Death book, but just the fact that these things occur is something that the skeptics deny. And in fact, I have documented that they do occur, and there's nothing they can say about that. So I really love confronting these sort of narrow-minded conventional thinkers with information that doesn't fit into their worldview, but yet is real.
Do you think you might take the James Randi $1 Million Challenge then?
I don't think James Randi will give that money to anybody.
No, it's got to exist first. So that's a really interesting backstory, and it's great because I was going to ask you. You talk about a stigma being attached on the UFO subject. There is probably no bigger stigma than the surviving death subject, because not only does it incorporate science, quantum physics science, which a lot of mainstream scientists don't always like to side with, but it also challenges people's religious beliefs. It challenges people's entire upbringing. It really is the greatest trigger to what I would call cognitive dissonance. It's the biggest challenge to that you could ever find, I think, or at least I think so. And what bigger stigma of a subject after a UFO book could you move on to than Surviving Death, really,
I know how to pick them, right? I know how to pick them.
You do, but it's how you present it. Having read the book, I bought the book at one of your seminars, and I think I was up till 3 a.m. reading it on night number 1, and it is a brilliant book. I know I've said this already, but I do urge people, after you've enjoyed this discussion with it's not an interview, it's a discussion. I urge people to buy it for that very reason, because there are a lot of people in the movement who, which is fine, follow what I call the airy-fairy route, but if you can back up things with good data, that's always the best way, and this is proved. But could you perhaps tell me? I know you started moving into that area whilst you were involved with the UFO book. You were already starting. Where do you start with a subject like surviving death? I mean, it is a vast subject. Can you recall where you first went in on what area you moved into first of all with your research?
Good question. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of people know something about near-death experiences just because there's so much in the media. But I think one of the things that got me going initially was the reincarnation cases of young children, because I ended up going to the UK and actually meeting with the family in Scotland of a small boy who had these memories from a past life. And so that really intrigued me, and I started to study the work of Ian Stevenson, who was the pioneer from the University of West Virginia here in the States, a pioneer investigating cases for decades of children, very, very young children that remember a past life that is then found, the information is recorded that they give, and then they're able to prove that that person actually existed, and that what the child had said is actually accurate. So that really interested me, because it was just so concrete. It was so black and white. We talk about airy-fairy. Nothing airy-fairy about those cases.
No, and that's the important bit, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's getting kids who've reported it, because it's so rare.
It's so rare that the cases that you have to have enough data, and enough it has to be very specific. So you have to have enough that's very specific. It needs to be objectively recorded. There needs to be a record of it before you begin searching for what we call the previous personality, meaning the person they were before. Because you have to have it all recorded, because if it's not, it could be changed after the fact. You can't have the mother coming around after you find the person and say, oh, well, they did say that about the person, right? It all has to be on the record first. So not only is it hard to find a child that actually has enough of those memories, but it's hard to find a case that's managed properly in order to do accurate investigations. But there are cases like that. And even Stevenson had documented many of them. He was a psychiatrist who traveled the world documenting these cases, but most of them were in Asia and Thailand and, India, Burma, cultures that really accept reincarnation as part of a reality, so that these families were not hesitant about bringing them forward. But what's interesting in the book that I just wrote, in Surviving Death, I was able to cover 2 cases that actually took place in America very recently, which is quite amazing, but they're really among the best cases we have ever. And they took place here.
And you documented them, which is great, because there's nothing more. I always say the truth is when it exists in yourself, when you actually have first-hand input into it. When someone else has done research and gives you the data, that's fine. But when you do the research yourself, or any medium out there will probably say that it's when it happens to them, they know the truth. And you had that experience. Was it with James Leininger?
Yeah, I mean, again, I reported on this. It wasn't like I was there when he was actually having the memories. When he was 2 years, it happened when he was 2 years old. So it wasn't quite like you said. I mean, I spent a lot of time interacting with his parents, his father in particular, about the case. And I met him, but when I met him, he was 18 years old, and this happened when he was 2. Wow. So no, I wasn't actually present for the unfolding of that case. I wish I had been. But other than, that's just the way it is. And the second case that I reported on, the child was 12 when I met him. He was younger. And for that case, the case of blanking out on his name. How could I possibly blank out? The second little boy in my book, Ryan.
Yes, Ryan.
He had there was an investigator involved with that case from day one, which is really great. There was an outside investigator actually documenting everything that the child was saying before they found the previous person. So it wasn't me, but nonetheless, my job is to report on these things. So I did all the necessary interviews that I needed to do and got all the data and all the records and everything else.
And what can you tell us about James? We'll use James Leininger's case as the main one. People can discover the second one when they buy your book. But the James Leininger case is particularly interesting, though, isn't it? I mean, it is rather gripping. It's emotional as well. It's anything but. I mean, the first of all, just to point out to people, I will ask you to explain this, but that this was verified. It's not a past life experience that this child had, which was a traumatic one, and they couldn't find information. They actually found the historic information of the person that he claimed to be, and the trauma for the family, not only the little boy, but the family as well. Could you tell us some about that?
And it all matched. Yeah, I mean, it was just incredible, because it turned out there were about 12 different things. I mean, I even have a list of them somewhere in the book that turned out that he presented a lot of information. Just to give a background. So his parents kept records of it. And a lot of it, some of it, I think they lost the record. Oh yeah, not everything was documented before they began their search for the previous person. So the only data that I worked with was the information that was on the record before they found out who the person was. And that's what's significant. There were 12 different things that James said. And it all started when he was not even 2. I mean, that's what's so incredible about these cases. These young children who have never been exposed to anything related to what it is that they're talking about. So that's what makes it so evidential. It's not like an adult who goes and has a hypnotic regression and then starts coming out with stuff. These are little tiny kids. And this little guy, I mean, he was obsessed with World War II airplanes at a very young age. I mean, the very first incident that occurred was when he was in a stroller walking along with his mom, and they were walking by a shop that had a bin outside with plastic toys in it, and she picked up an airplane and gave it to him. And it was this plastic plane, and she said, "Look, it has a bomb under it," because it had a big lump on the bottom. And James looked at her and says, "That's not a bomb, Mommy, that's a drop tank." And she said, "What's a drop tank?" And she went home and told her husband, and her husband said, "Oh yeah, that's a tank where they store gas when they're driving long distances in airplanes." And they thought, how did he know about that? That was just the first thing. So and then his dad took him to a museum and where they had all these World War II airplanes inside this big, massive building in Dallas, and he was freaking out, would not, just staring at these planes. He wouldn't go anywhere else. He was shrieking. He just had this incredible reactions. So, and then he started to have nightmares in which he was reliving the experience of being shot down in a plane and catching on fire and crashing into the water. And he would have these nightmares 5 or 6 times a week, intense screaming and just terror, waking up in this kind of fetal position. And he would say, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." He just repeat that all the time. And eventually he revealed, over a period of between the ages of about 2 and 3, maybe 3.5 to 4, he revealed a lot of information, and it was all very natural. When he would just come out, his parents didn't pressure him for it or anything. And he talked about how he said he was in I won't give you all the chronology of it. It just take too much time, and you can read it in the book. But he was able to give the name, for instance, of his best friend in that life. He said the guy's name was Jack Larson. Now that's a first name and a last name. He said that he was shot by the Japanese in the front of the plane, and that he flew off of an aircraft carrier called the Natoma. These are, again, very, very specific information. He said he flew a kind of plane called a Corsair, that kind of level of detail. He flew near Iwo Jima, which was an island off of Japan. He pointed to that on a map once with his dad and said, that's where I died, things like that. So, and his dad was very Christian and very religious. You were saying how it's a threat to people's religions, right? Well, that was how it was for James Leininger's father. His name's Bruce. And what I did in my book was I had Bruce comment throughout the chapter describing what his own journey was like dealing with this information, because I thought that would help people who had religious beliefs, because he was in complete denial, and all he wanted to do was prove his son wrong, because he could not accept that this could possibly be a reincarnation story. So every time his son came up with something, he would go on the internet and try to research it. And he would find out, unfortunately, that his son was accurate. Suddenly he looked up Natoma, and there was an aircraft carrier there, and he found out what dates it was, and everything added up. Then he started going to these reunions with servicemen from the Natoma Bay. There was a Jack Larson there, et cetera, et cetera. And so he had to deal with this. And eventually James had also said, this little James, when he was around 3, he started to draw massive quantities of pictures of the crash. So he drew all these pictures of these airplanes on fire, falling down, with bombs flying around, and bullets flying around everything.
Yeah.
And his parents, and he would sign them James 3.
Right.
James and the number 3. And his parents would say, "Why are you signing them James 3?" And he would say, "I'm the 3rd James. I'm the 3rd James." And they thought, it didn't make any sense to them. Well, it turned out after a long search that his dad finally went to these veterans meetings, and he was able to track down who was, because his son had said he flew off that aircraft carrier, where he was located, etc. He was able to find out that there was only one person that flew off of that aircraft carrier who died in World War II, and his name was James Houston Jr. And the interesting thing was that the junior meant that this James, when he said, "I'm the 3rd James," right? If he had been James Jr. before, this time he was James the 3rd.
Right.
So, and every fact that James had given about this past life matched the life of this young guy who died in 1945, James Houston Jr., His best friend was Jack Larson. You know, he was able to gather maps of where Houston died, and the specific details of what James had said about how the crash happened, what part of the airplane was hit, things like that, all matched the data that his dad was able to find out later regarding, you know, the death of this James Houston. And they actually found James Houston's sister also. She was in her 80s at the time, because
Wow.
you know, this death took place in 1945, and she confirmed a lot of the stuff that James said about their childhoods. He had all these memories, and she became convinced that he was indeed the reincarnation of her brother. Um, and she also had pictures of James Houston Jr. with the Corsair, because he didn't actually die in a Corsair plane. It's just the last detail I'll give you. But when he crashed, he was not in a Corsair, which was a very kind of specialized aircraft of the time that was like a top edge, you know, really good plane.
Mm-hmm.
And his dad was so thrilled that, because his dad didn't want him to be accurate, that he was wrong about the Corsair. He didn't
Mm-hmm.
get that right. But it turned out, after they met James Houston's sister, she sent them some photographs. And it turned out there was one of James Houston Jr. standing with a Corsair.
Oh, wow.
And James had insisted that he flew a Corsair, even though everyone was telling him no. He could have just agreed, you know, but he didn't.
Yeah.
He knew what happened. And it
Wow.
turned out that James Houston had flown a Corsair. It was a very specialized aircraft, but and it was something that he would have been really excited and proud of. So it sort of makes sense that might carry through in a memory.
Yes.
And it was just that he wasn't flying that at the time that he was killed. So
Amazing.
anyway, that's sort of an overview, and it's very interesting to watch Bruce's his dad's kind of transition
Mm.
as he comments on all of this and tells part of the story himself. And then by the time it's all over, even though he was, you know, kind of very conventional Christian, he came to realize that this was not in contradiction to how he saw God and spirituality, that somebody being born again like this, he was able to find a way of incorporating it into his religion.
Mm. He found
Which is,
peace with it.
he found peace with it, and it made sense to him, and he didn't feel it to be a contradiction anymore. And I think, you know, ultimately, I think that can happen for anyone,
Yeah,
really.
I
I
think
really
so.
do, no matter what their religion. So.
I think what's really interesting in the case, and I think what is one thing I took away from that case, the way you presented it and the way Bruce spoke about it, Leslie, was,
Mhm.
um, you know, a lot of people you meet in the movement of mediumship and past life, because it all sort of intertwines along the way. A lot of people always speak of beautiful spiritual experiences, but in the case of James Leininger, it's a traumatic event as much as it is an incredible discovery that challenges not only the scientific, psychological aspects of life, but
Mhm.
it's challenging. But it's challenging everything. It's what we don't expect, but the trauma and everything around it just goes to show the reality of it to me. It was gripping. It was a gripping story that moved you when you read it. It was impossible not to feel emotion for Bruce and for James
Right,
and the
and
whole
for James.
family.
Yeah,
You
because
know,
it integrated James's whole life. It wasn't, I mean, there were times where he was just a normal kid,
yeah.
but there was an emotional component for him too. It wasn't just memory. It was, you know, he had all the airplanes, he played with them, he created scenes where he would be jumping out of a cockpit but would survive. You know, there's all this sort of psychological aspects
Mm,
to it, like you're saying. And what's interesting is that in the research that Ian Stevenson did on these cases for many, many, many decades, most of the cases do involve a death that's traumatic. In other words, they're usually an accident or a murder or a drowning or, you know, something unexpected that happens to a person at a fairly young age, as opposed to somebody who dies peacefully in their 80s, you know. So it seems like there may be something unresolved that gets carried over, and
yeah.
that's part of the reason why these children remember these things, because they were traumatic for them.
Have
So
you
that's
come
an
up?
interesting point.
I just wonder though. We're now a couple of years down the line now since Surviving Death has come out,
Hmm.
and certainly with something like the James Leininger case, I've heard and I have heard um, spirit communicators through mediums down the years, some who advocate, who agree with reincarnation. If we just use the word reincarnation, and others who say they know of nobody who's reincarnated.
Right.
So there is also this strange contradiction that goes on in that aspect of things, and it leaves me to it really leaves me to wonder on the whole thing. Have you yourself managed to, in this last couple of years, come any further forward um, with more information, or any? I suppose what I want to know is any psychologist or any researcher who is trying to prove this, have they come any further with a theory on the whole aspect? Do you know?
No, I mean it's in terms of the intellectual study of it, I mean the theory really just the fact that if a psychologist or psychiatrist who studies this is willing to say, well, reincarnation seems to be the best explanation of the
Yeah,
data, that is a big step for them.
yeah,
You know what I mean? And to have a theory beyond that, like how it happens or what goes on between the lives or any of that stuff, to them is just pure speculation. So they don't really go there. I mean, I'm sure some of them have their own opinions about it, but the person who took over the work of Ian Stevenson by the name of Jim Tucker is the person I interviewed a lot. And he worked with James Leininger and also worked on the Ryan Hammond's case, which is the other case. And he's done published papers on cases and really studied this. And he basically has concluded that these are stories involving reincarnation. But I don't see how, and we can't really go beyond that
yeah,
because it's not data anymore.
yeah,
It's not journalism, it's not science. So, um, and I think it's interesting what you say, because I know that's true, that different spirit guides or spirit communicators might say different things about this issue. And
yeah.
we don't have concrete uniformity.
No,
But I guess that's true about a lot of things.
you only have to look at our
So
world to find that.
that's part of the mystery of the whole thing.
And
You know?
can I just clarify? Am I right? I
Yeah.
made a note earlier on. 55 verified memories. Is that correct for James Leininger?
That was for Ryan Hammonds. That was the other little boy.
Okay, so
Yeah, I mean
55.
that case was unbelievable too. That
Yeah,
case that had 55. I mean, so many, and they were all verified to be accurate, and they were all recorded. I mean, that was so extraordinary because the mom sent these emails every time her son came out with something. She wrote it in an email and sent it to Jim Tucker, the lead investigator at the University of Virginia, who's the
mm,
leading expert in the world on these cases. He's a child psychiatrist. So he had this file of everything James had said before they started to do any research. So nobody could have claimed later that anything was altered,
yeah,
And they had to hire professional. The previous person in that case was a Hollywood actor, so they had to hire. He was an obscure actor. He was an extra in a film and this little boy had actually pointed to a photograph and said that was me. So they had to go on was a photograph, but no name or anything. So they had to hire a professional film archivist. But this was after a couple of years of Ryan providing this information.
yeah,
And then they were able to find this individual who matched the photo, and it turned out that 55 things that James had said about him applied and were
wow,
accurate. They were able to find his daughter, who was now in her 50s, who was only 8 when the previous person died. So, yeah, I mean, it's just very hard to explain and to find any other explanation for this, I think. For other than it being, because there's also so much emotion around it for these kids, and they have the
yeah,
nightmares and they're reliving things.
yeah,
It's not just a sort of a cold memory, which might you think, well, it's some psychic perception they have for some
yeah,
reason. And these people had no connection to their families. They were not. There was no way that they could have known anything about them. They died decades earlier. So I don't know. I find them some of the most compelling evidence for survival past death. I find to be these cases of these
I,
children.
I think in these cases as well, what is fascinating is these children have now grown up in James Leininger's case, he must be in his 20s now.
Well, I think he's about 19 now. Yeah, 19.
Okay.
Yeah.
With no psychic abilities as far as we're aware.
Right.
And
Absolutely. And totally normal kid.
yeah.
Very normal, did great in school. And what happens is they usually around the age 5, 6, 7 forget all their memories.
Wow.
You know,
They
it's
go
like,
down into the subconscious.
yeah, and they just forget it, and they just, you know, which is fine. You know, the parents are happy. They want them to be normal kids
Of
and not be
course.
haunted by these things. And usually there's something that happens that gives them, this is another component that's so interesting, that the kids are often, like, if they're taken back to the location of where they lived before, which is what they did with James. They took him back when he was 8 to the actual place on the ocean where his plane crashed, which they were able to get from a map.
Wow.
And it was very cathartic for him. He just sat there sobbing. His parents were stunned. They did a little ritual. They were just going to say goodbye to James Houston because they wanted their son to be able to move on.
Yeah.
And so they had this ritual planned, and they were going to, you know, and they did this little ritual, and then James just was sobbing and sobbing, and he just said goodbye to James Houston, you know. And so there's often some kind of closure like that for the kids. With Ryan, they took him back to the house where he had lived before. So that's another component, you know, if it
Mm.
that just shows that there's something really real going on for these kids in relation to these other lives, the previous life, that's profound and emotional and has transformative for them. And they need to be able
Yeah.
to move beyond it.
Yeah.
So sometimes there's some event like that that will allow them to move beyond it, which for them is often going back to a location or meeting a family member or something like that.
And
Yeah.
it's so unexplainable in the grand scheme of things, isn't it? It's hard to pinpoint exactly what is going on there, how the mechanics of it in any way. And equally, I'm going to ask you about this now because this is equally um, not otherworldly, but the mechanics of consciousness is a strange thing. I read a part in the book simply titled "The Shoe on the Ledge."
Yeah.
Now this moves on from reincarnation, people having past life
Mm-hmm.
things, but this is now the case of our consciousness, us as a person, our consciousness being absent of the body but still capable of observing. And it's just some of the documented cases that take that area of that field up, because like I said before, there's so many intertwining areas, isn't there? And the
Right.
subject of consciousness itself is a mystery. It's almost as hard to get your mind around as infinity itself, you know.
Exactly. And that's what I was trying to do in this book, is like draw the best stuff that sort of shows, so it all is about, really, it's about consciousness in its essence. You
Yes.
know, what is it, and can it exist separately from the body? And if it can exist separately from I mean, I went through a series of questions sort of in my book, because I started with reincarnation, which we just talked about. And then I realized, yeah, so okay, so if this happens, that must mean that that consciousness is functioning separately from the body, obviously, if it's got to go from one body to the next. So then I asked the question, is there data that shows that consciousness can exist separately from the body?
Mm.
Which would support the whole reincarnation theory, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we get to the subject that you just raised of veridical OBEs, which aren't proof of survival because the people aren't dead. But when
Yeah.
they're thoroughly unconscious, when they're going through cardiac arrest, they have no brain activity, no heartbeat. Their consciousness is able to separate from the body, and then when they wake up, they're able to report things that they heard or saw that can be verified. Again, it's about verification of information. So if somebody goes out and they're completely, essentially dead, and they can tell you what they saw, and the doctor in the room will say, well, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly what was happening. Then you can test the veracity of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the shoe on the ledge case is one of the most wonderful ones, which involved a woman who was under cardiac arrest. And again, these people are essentially, you know, clinically dead when these events happen.
Yeah.
Um, and she reported to a social worker who was looking after her that she had seen this tennis shoe sitting on the ledge outside of a window in the hospital when she had been dead. And, the social worker thought it was ridiculous, but the woman, their name was Maria, begged the social worker to go find that shoe. So she went looking. It was a picture in my book, massive medical center, right? So she went into every room, all through the second floor, and looking out the windows for the shoe, and she finally found it. And the details of this tennis shoe were exactly as the woman had described them. The color, the way the shoelaces were folded over, one of them was under the heel. And what was really fascinating to me, Warren, I mean, this little kind of detail, these little details are what really get you.
Yeah.
One of the physical aspects of the shoe that the woman had described before the social worker went to find it was only visible from outside of the window. So in other words, nobody could look from it, the only vantage point by which anyone could have seen that particular detail was from outside the window.
Yeah.
Meaning 3 stories up from the ground in the air. Because
Yes.
there were no other buildings there. There was no place where that anybody physically could have gone to see that shoe. So, so Maria got the shoe, and the woman was really emotional about it, and it became this sort of treasure in the hospital, and everybody's coming around to look at the shoe, So that was, but again, that's an example of what we call a veridical OBE, where somebody, as they experience it, leaves their body and is able to, when they're completely unconscious, and is able to report back what they saw or what they heard. She gave a lot of other details too about things that happened while they were trying to resuscitate her, other details, but this was the most extraordinary one. So those kinds of cases are really important because they show us that, yes, consciousness can function separately from the body. And that doesn't prove that that's what happens when we die, but it certainly supports that hypothesis.
Yes. Yeah, and
So
I think it definitely, for me, I think when you come into the subject of surviving death, as I know everybody has to come in from somewhere, but it tends to be a process for a lot of people for where they start. And I know when I first started, this kind of area was, I think, one of the first places I landed. Out of body experiences, as I come to know them. And I remember reading Dr. Raymond Moody, who documented so much on this over the years. And it kind of reminds me, that story of the shoe on the ledge very much reminds me of a case that I think was in his book. And I'm certain it was. If I'm wrong, somebody will probably message me later on and say you were wrong. But there was a case where a lady had died, and she'd seen herself from above. She could see the doctors operating on her, and she was resuscitated. And later on, the surgeon who'd done the operation, or one of the surgeons, came to see her on the ward, and she explained to him how she'd seen the whole thing. And he sort of, as they often do, that was just the anesthetic. You were dreaming, and it has effects on the mind. And, she said, no, I definitely heard every word you said. And she said what he said. She repeated, and it must have struck a chord with him. And then she went on to say, well, when I was above my body, there was a cabinet in the surgery, in the room, in the theatre room. And on top of the cabinet was 2 coins. And she was able to describe what those 2 old coins were. And I think, if I remember right, she even described which one was heads and which one was tails.
Wow. Wow.
So he went off to go back, and he got the better of it all afternoon. It was going around his head, and in the end, he couldn't resist. So he went in, got a chair, stood up, and there were the 2 coins. Now, there's only one vantage point you would know that exists, and that's from the vantage point of consciousness being outside the body, observing from a different angle. What other way is there of doing it?
That's right. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? And there are also cases of blind people who have never had vision for their whole lives.
Yes.
And then there's one case I describe a little bit in the book of a woman who was like that, and she almost died in a car crash, and she was completely unconscious. They were trying to resuscitate her, and she described seeing for the first time.
Wow.
I mean, she didn't even know what it was, and she didn't even like it. It was scary, but she could see,
Yes.
Just phenomenal. So there's a number of cases like that too.
I think I know I mentioned mainstream science and quantum physics earlier on. I think quantum physics, I've read a lot of studies where they're starting to, really get deep into what consciousness is. Understanding it is another thing altogether, but they are starting to go there. Whether consciousness is part of this physical makeup, or whether it already exists outside and uses this body as a lens to observe. The
Right.
questions are deep, but I do think eventually we will start to see some answers in our lifetimes. Maybe not all of them, but I think we'll start to get a grasp of what's going on.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I
but
mean, Pim Van Lommel, who wrote a chapter. By the way, my book includes 10 chapters written by other people.
yes,
And the Shoe on the Ledge, for instance, chapter was written actually by the social worker herself, who was the one who discovered that shoe. So I really like having other people contribute because they can give an even more direct experiential story than I can.
Yeah.
And I think it's great to have other voices in the book. But I was just going to mention Pim Van Lommel, who's a very famous cardiologist who has studied near-death experience. He's one of the leading experts in the world, who also wrote a chapter. And he does deal with what you were just talking about the nature of consciousness and how he sees it as, the brain is sort of like an antenna, but there's consciousness that's out there. And he sort of explores some of the theories of how we might explain the phenomenon of veridical OBEs and near-death experiences, which are something separate. But anyway, so it is really fascinating to try to explore how it might work.
Yes.
And I do hope that more studies are done about that.
I certainly hope so. And just to elaborate on the reason I picked the Shoe on the Ledge section is not only because I think it's wonderful, but recently I was online and doing some research, and I stumbled across somebody who, let's just say, is a professional skeptic. And they said, people churning up the shoe on the person who saw the trainer on the hospital, and they presented it as if it was all hearsay. And the reason I wanted to bring that in is because, having read that, it's worth challenging the fact that you've got the person who experienced that writing in your book, so it can't be hearsay because the real person is
and
there.
She has, she's had to deal with skeptics, and she's dealt with them very well over the years. I mean, this happened a number of years ago, and she's she's a very, very intelligent woman who has countered the arguments that the skeptics have made in great detail. So
and it's wonderful. And I'm now gonna see if I can morph from that subject to the next. We've looked at consciousness being as say it was me, my consciousness may be observing from somewhere else. In the next case, Finding George. This is the case where another person's potential consciousness is communicating through a medium and giving specific information that goes beyond the knowledge of not only the sitter and not only the medium, but can only be known by the alleged consciousness, spirit person, as we might want to call them, communicating to the medium in the case of Finding George. And I mentioned this because Sandy Ingham has been interviewed. We've interviewed Robin Foy from the Skull Group. We've interviewed Sandy Ingham, and of course Sandy Ingham is the medium that is included in this section, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm sure your viewers and listeners are probably all familiar with what mediumship is, right? And with mental mediumship and all that. Because of course in the book I explain all of that because it's written for somebody who might not know anything about it. Yeah. And what I think is interesting in terms of the progression of dealing with consciousness is once it can be established that consciousness does function independently of the brain, right, which we've sort of done in a very sketchy way, then the question becomes, well, if that's the case, can it communicate to us when it's in a disembodied state?
Yeah.
And you can approach this very something. You say, well, it would be reasonable if it exists. It should be, so that's when I started to explore mental mediumship myself.
Yeah.
And of course, there's incredible data from mental mediums. And I had my own personal experiences, which I write about in the book too, dealing with my own sittings with mediums that were absolutely extraordinary, really evidential. So and the case that you brought up is an example of a really, really, really good reading where, for a reading to be really good, that has to be very specific. And so Sandy Ingham was reading for this man named Mark, who had a great uncle by the name of George, and he had always felt this incredible affinity for his uncle, even though he never met him, because his uncle died, I think it was his great uncle, died in World War I. But for some reason, Mark just always felt this connection to this particular person. And he wanted to see if he could find where he was, because they didn't know where he'd been buried. Or I think the story was he had been missing in action from World War I. But they really knew very, very little about him. And so he went to see Sandy, and she had no idea why he was coming or anything like that. And just got this very, very, very specific information that came through Walter, who was Mark's grandfather, the brother of George. She got the name of Walter, and Walter was talking about George, and she was describing George, and and then she kept saying, "I hear G22," and nobody knew what that meant. She said, "Loud and clear, I hear G22, G22." And she said, "I also know I hear one of four." Nobody knew what that meant, but then Mark went and got a whole bunch of diagrams of graves from grave burial sites around the location where his great uncle was supposed to have died, and did all this research, got maps and stuff, and it turned out that there was, in one of them, there were 4 plots, 4 sections in the graves, and one of the gravestones was called G22, and it was an unmarked grave. It corresponded to, which he thought might have corresponded to his uncle, because when they died in action and they didn't know who they were, they just put them in an unmarked grave. It gets fairly complicated, but just the fact that she had said one of 4 and G22, and it fit in this particular burial map. And then, but Mark still wanted more, so he went back to Sandy again, didn't tell her anything that he had learned. And she said she was hearing the name, she said George was telling her this, that he was close to some kind of a name. She said close to Albert, Albertone, or something like that, or Alberone. And Mark didn't know what that was about, but when he went back and he got a list of all the graves in that graveyard, it turned out the one next door to G22 was a man named Alberone, who had died. So, the thing that was really interesting about it was, of course, that it was so specific, but also, as you mentioned, there was no human being on the planet Earth that knew where George had been buried. And a lot of the people who want to deny the validity of mediumship will claim that information is just gleaned through mediums from psychic abilities, that the mediums are picking up the information from somebody else here, right? They're using their psychic powers through telepathy or clairvoyance or whatever to get information for the sitter, but it really isn't coming from a dead person. And this case is interesting because it shows that no living person had this information. And I in the chapter, I go into more detail about and sort of eliminate how it would be very unlikely that this medium could have used clairvoyance to find the map, and from all these different sources put together the G22. And it's very, very hard to explain that this information coming from anybody but George. I mean, that's the point of the chapter. And it was, it's very, very powerful. So I think if it's fairly complicated, so I didn't do it justice, but if you read the chapter, you'll understand that it's one of the better mental mediumship cases that I've ever seen documented.
Yes. It most certainly is. I think it is, and that's why it's important to, I'm sorry, we have somebody gate crashing the picture in the background. It's the only quiet room in the house where you'll sit still tonight, I'm afraid. We have
no problem.
I've been photobombed. It is a great...
Actually, Mark sent me, just so people know, Mark sent me all the notes that he took right after the reading,
Yeah.
I wrote everything down, so I was privy to all the direct information about the readings. And so, I really trusted him. He was a very, very astute, intelligent guy,
That's right.
who was very skeptical when he went in.
What
very
better way to be?
Yeah.
What better way to be? I mean, if you want to have it proved to you, the best way to go in was with a question in mind.
Right.
so that all the boxes are ticked.
And then he
It
went
lead,
to visit the grave, and it provided all this incredible sense of closure for him and of connection,
yeah,
that he finally understood what happened to his great uncle George, that he felt so profoundly connected to. And it was really a moving thing for the whole family.
yeah,
I mean, there's no way they can prove 100% that he's there,
yes.
but all the information that came through certainly, you know, look
It
that way very,
ticks a
very
lot of
strongly.
ticks a lot of boxes.
Right. So that's a really, really great mental mediumship case. Yeah.
So on the subject of mental mediumship, you had your own cases. Without going into too much detail, but briefly, as they are private, I appreciate some people like to keep these things private. Is there anything you can share of your own experiences? I mean, did you tick a lot of boxes?
Did I what?
Tick a lot of boxes. There was a lot of information
Oh yeah.
correct.
And I mean, even though they were private, I described them all in the book. I gave all the information that came through, and it would take a long time to deal with that, I think
Yeah,
now. But I was very careful that the medium. I did 2 readings that were really spectacular, and particularly in the second one, the medium had no idea who I was. She didn't know my name, nothing about me, not even my name, where I lived, anything. And it was all done through the computer, just like we're talking now.
yeah,
And she just came up with so much accurate information about 2 people who I had lost recently before I did these readings. And they not only detailed information, but personality traits. The personalities of the 2 people came through. So it's very, very powerful to experience that. I'm sure a lot of people watching this have experienced it. But, I went in, and I just went in again, not expecting necessarily anything to happen, you know? And then it was like boom, 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 just point after point after point that was accurate and just mind blowing to me.
it's
And
amazing.
it really felt like those 2 people were there, I have to say. I mean, and so after I taped the interviews, so then afterwards I was able to become more of a journalist and go through and sort of analyze the accuracy of everything. And they were both, 85, 90% accurate, which is very, very high.
And it leads me to ask you, from a journalist point of view, of course, you're looking at it from a journalist point of view. You're trying to keep your trained mind in that position.
Although not during the reading.
Of course, not during the
During the
you.
reading, I just let go and enjoy and get into my
Yeah.
intuitive sense, knowing though, because I'm taping it, that I can do the analytical thing afterwards. Yeah.
And can it still bring an element of comfort?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Good.
Definitely,
Yeah.
because I mean, if you're going to do a reading, you don't want to be wearing your analytical hat throughout the reading.
No.
I mean, I wanted to let the reading do what it's supposed to do
Yeah.
and bring the right kind of energy to it that would facilitate it happening. So I put all that kind of stuff aside, and yes, it did bring comfort. It was really, really wonderful for me. And it
Wonderful.
verified things that had happened, after death communications that I had felt that I had received from my brother were kind of verified by the readings. And, a lot of things happened that were interconnected with other experiences that I'd had. So it was very, really just wonderful,
I
really life
think,
changing. Yeah.
and so I exactly as it should be, which is wonderful. Now, with mental mediumship, this group is called Sacred Dance with Trance. So a lot of people bundle trance mediumship and physical mediumship into the same bag, and that's mainly because trance often leads into physical.
Hmm.
It's the common path. It seems to be the most accepted path that it follows. But realistically, and to be completely correct on this, trance mediumship is a form of mental mediumship. Now,
I guess
you,
that's true. Yeah. It's just a sort of a more advanced form, I guess you would say,
I
because you can have
suppose,
more of
yeah,
a two-way conversation. I'm thinking about, for instance, Mrs. Piper as an example, the famous historical medium who was a trance medium.
Leonora Piper.
Leonora Piper, yeah, she's just an example of the best of
Uh,
trance mediumship. But there's
exactly.
nothing physical that happens, but people can act, she's unconscious, and the communicators speak through her. And what's incredible is people can have these two-way conversations.
Yeah.
Whereas with mental mediumship, you're more in a passive kind of receptive, receiving mode, and you receive whatever comes through. And you might ask one or two simple questions, but you can't dialogue
No, that's
like you
right.
can in trance. And the kinds of cases that went on with Leonora Piper, the kinds of dialogues that people were able to have with their deceased loved ones, just phenomenal, because she was in a trance
Yeah.
state.
Exactly. And I think
Yeah.
she is very comparable to Gladys Osborne Leonard from a very
Right.
similar period in history.
Right.
You've got one stateside and one in the UK, and both of them seem to be very similar in the quality of their trance communication. But not only the quality of the trance communication, but the mere fact that a loved one, your brother, my grandfather, whoever, was able to speak through the medium, concisely, accurately provide information. Now, the thing with trance mediumship, that also subcategorizes off into two paths. You've got philosophical trance mediums, where questions about life and such like can be asked,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure that there are ways of quantifying whether any of that could be somewhat evidential. But the real way of doing it is with the likes of Leonora Piper and Mrs. Leonard, who brought specific loved ones to talk through her. She didn't, but those who worked in the unseen world did. And it's the
Right.
quality of that documented evidence that is really important by those loved ones. Can I just clarify, maybe, is that what you would call a drop-in communicator?
Yeah, I mean, there are cases of drop-in communicators coming in through trance mediums and through physical mediums.
Yes.
So the one that I love, the one that I talk about a lot, which I think is so evidential, was through, I think it was Indridasan.
Yes, the
If I'm saying
Icelandic
it
medium.
correct, I might not be saying his name correctly though.
It's Indridasan.
Indridasan. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I remember every time I do interviews, I look up how to say it, but then I didn't do that today. So
It was actually my next question, because I wanted to ask, with
yeah,
regards to drop-in communicators, there is a
right.
wonderful story about this medium who died so young.
Yeah, I mean, he was unbelievable, this medium. But just to get back a little bit to the general question, I mean, I'm Alan Gold, the famous investigator, wrote a chapter in my book about trance mediumship. So it's
Yes.
really wonderful. He writes about Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Leonard, and he also talks about some drop-in communicator cases in there involving. But I think they were physical. But there was a story of Runke's leg, which is a really famous one. Um, and I don't know if your listeners all know what a drop-in communicator is, so maybe we should just to
Please
explain that.
explain. Yes.
It's basically when somebody comes in from the spirit world who is completely unrelated to any of the sitters or to the medium. So he or she, let's just say he for the sake of simplicity, just suddenly comes through that medium, and nobody knows who they are, and the medium didn't ask them to come in. The medium doesn't know who they are. So that's why they call them drop in. They're just suddenly dropping in out of nowhere. And they're some of the most evidential cases I think we have. I mean, to me, drop-in communicators are one of the most evidential, highly evidential points that we have in favor of survival. I mean, they're very hard to explain away in any other way. It involves somebody because a lot of the arguments that people will make to explain away trance mediumship or physical mediumship is that it's the people in the room that are creating the phenomena, right? The sitters and the medium, and they're all connected. The sitters that come through are connected to the spirit communicators are connected to the sitters, and therefore there could be a lot of psychic perception going on where the medium is using their own psychic abilities to read the minds of the sitters or whatever and present information.
Yeah.
But if it's a drop-in communicator that has no connection to the sitters, and the information comes through and nobody knows if that information is true or not, even the medium,
Yeah.
then it's very evidential, because you can't say it was some kind of psychic trick on the part of the medium, or it's some kind of deception where he's reading somebody's mind in the room, because nobody in the whole room knows who this person is.
That's right.
So it kind of separates it even one step more the realm of evidence, of
Yeah.
objective, disconnected evidence that's not being generated by anybody involved. And that's what's so compelling about it. So in the case of, as an example, I'm just pulling up my piece of paper here because I don't want to get anything wrong. I hope I can remember it. But the case of Indradi, he was a medium who lived in Iceland back in the early 1900s, and he actually died when he was 28 years old, which is such a shame, of typhoid fever, because he was probably one of the best physical mediums ever. I mean, just, and he was so Erlander Haraldsson is an investigator. He's a professor at the University of Iceland, a psychologist, and he's now in his 80s. He has spent his life investigating these kinds of things, mediums, past life cases. So he did an in-depth study of Indradi, and he wrote a book about him that only came out about 2 years ago or something. And I highly recommend everybody read it. It's fascinating. Because when Indradi was practicing, there was a whole intellectual community in Iceland of scientists and investigators and psychologists and all these very sophisticated intellectuals who formed a study group to document Indradi. So it was they wrote everything down in what they called minute books.
Yeah.
So everything that happened in his seances was recorded. And so there's a record of what happened by very astute people. These were not people making anything up. These were skeptical intellectuals. So one of the things that came through, and the records of stuff that happened in his sessions were just amazing. There's a lot of independent voice, which was spectacular. But there was a man named Mr. Jensen who was a drop-in communicator who just showed up one night. And he spoke a different language. That's another thing, Warren. When you have a drop-in communicator who doesn't even speak the language of the people, or certainly not of the medium.
Exactly.
So this guy, it was recorded. I guess, I don't know if anybody even understood him at the time. I'm not sure how that worked, but I know he spoke Danish with a Danish accent, which Indradi didn't have. And he described a fire that was going on in real time in Denmark. And said that, they had the timing and everything, that he had witnessed this fire, and then he came back and was talking about this fire that had happened. And in Iceland at that time, there was no way to get news. You had to wait for the newspapers to come on a boat months, weeks later. There were no radios or anything. So about a month later, the newspaper came, and they found that there was this fire in Copenhagen, a major fire that corresponded with the exact timing and the details that there were about 4 or 5 details that he'd given, which were all accurate to this fire. And then it turned out that it turned out through other minute books that Erlander Haraldsson found years later that Indradi had given, Mr. Jensen had given a lot of other information about himself. Had to do with, his siblings, where he lived, when he died, that he wasn't married, blah, 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 a lot of details. And he was, Haraldsson spent all this time in archival sources, went to Copenhagen and all these different ways of digging up information on this guy, and it was able to find that this information he had provided through Indradi was all accurate. So in fact, we know that this man actually lived.
Yeah.
Somebody that actually lived, popped in through the consciousness of a medium that nobody in the room knew. But the fact that just in terms of the scientific part, the fact that Erlander Haraldsson was able to prove that he actually existed, the name, the place where he lived, everything about him, is phenomenal.
Yeah.
And the data about Mr. Jensen had to be located from a lot of different sources. So people who want to doubt mediumship, it's very hard for them to make the argument that the clairvoyant abilities of that medium were so incredible that in a split second he was able to go to 5 different sources in some obscure location in Copenhagen to pull together the information.
Exactly.
One of the things that makes it evidential is that the information was not in only one place.
Yes.
So it's just a very, very evident. It's very hard to explain that this wasn't actually the spirit of Mr. Jensen that was speaking.
Yeah.
You know, with all, and I, in the chapter we have actually Haraldson. Again, I like Haraldson wrote the chapter in my book on this case.
Yeah.
He was the guy who actually investigated it. So I said, why don't you tell the story about Indradi? So he wrote the chapter, and he describes the actual, you know, specific statements that Jensen made and how he went and found them and documented them and makes the list of the points of information and all of that. It's fascinating to read.
It
But
is.
yeah, I mean, you know, how you can explain that away is very, so I think that, you know, I've done a lot of work reading other philosophers and PhDs and people who have studied the evidence for survival, and it's pretty much agreed that among that community that these drop-in cases are top of the list in
Yeah.
terms of hardcore evidence.
And I think what really supports the Indradi's thing is, as you say, I mean, it's from a time before communication almost. You know, today it must be so difficult uh, to a case like that today. We have news coming in to our eyes and ears in seconds of it breaking. But in those days, the mere idea that you would have to spend, you know, just a, you know, you'd have to spend a month on a boat to get those newspapers to find it. I mean, how would a skeptic ever, you know, explain that away?
You can't. You can't. I mean, there were 7 statements that he made in 1905 that Jensen made that nobody knew if at the time if they were true or not. They just wrote
Yes,
them down in their book. So,
it's
you know, they didn't
amazing.
make them up. They wrote them down in the book. The book was stashed away. And I think nobody knew that this particular book existed until Erlander went and found it. It was in some collection of some professor, and, you know, the grandmother had sat with him, and, you know, he found this thing decades later. And there were 7 points that specific points that he had given, and they were all shown to be accurate. And, you know, so, and he had to look in, I'm looking at it now, like all these different places to get that information.
It's amazing, isn't it?
But this man really lived. It'd be one thing, you know, if a drop-in communicator came through with a lot of data and you couldn't verify it, you would never know if it meant anything or not.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that happens a lot. But when you can actually verify that that person lived, and that
Yeah.
you know, and everything, and the other one of the points that the researchers look for is, okay, if there's a drop-in communicator, they have these criteria, and one of them is there needs to be a reason, a motivation for that communicator to come through. You know, it makes it even more evidential if there is. And the way the way he saw that was that it turned out that Jensen lived only 2 buildings down from where that big fire was.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they, you know, they understand his motivation as being that he was naturally concerned about that fire.
Yeah.
And he just sort of wanted to alert. I don't know, somehow he's agitated about the fire, but it turned out that it was right next door to where he lived. And I have a photograph in the book of that specific location showing the building that had burned and the building that he lived in. So, you know, it's very, very amazing. But we don't have a lot of cases like that on the record, unfortunately. You
No.
wonder how many there are, you know, and how many records have been kept that have never been investigated.
Exactly. And how many, you know, I know when Kathy interviewed me for this program originally, the question was that she asked me, are there other mediums out there doing this? And of course, the answer is yes, there are. But how many more of them are out there doing this, bringing such evidence through, is so difficult to quantify, because probably most of them are safe and sound in their home circles, where they're going to be away from ridicule and pressure. And
Right.
I would imagine that would have been the case back then. So a lot of information, if it was even investigated by the circles, but if it was, would have gone to the grave with the circle. You know,
That's true, because they don't write them down also.
it's such a shame. We're talking about a time in this case of Indradi, long before being able to record it with our devices like we can now. It's such a shame. But
I know. So anyway, if you
you
hear of
know,
any other mediums getting drop-in communicators, just tell them, write down what they say.
and
I
send it
mean,
to
the other
Leslie.
thing is, it takes someone like an Erlander Haraldson. He had to spend his own resources to go to Denmark, to go to
Yeah,
Copenhagen, and work hard to find the information. And not many people are motivated to do that. So
no, they're not.
that's the other thing. The other thing that's interesting about this man was Emil Jensen. He actually ended up materializing later on and really being a part of some of these seances. And he
Really.
ended up coming through and materializing in the seance room. Yeah.
Which perfectly leads me on to the next section, because it was Indradi's physical mediumship, but not only Indradi's physical mediumship in general.
Yeah.
Because I think I've seen lots and lots of people mainly, in all fairness, due to their um, lack of knowledge on
Mm-hmm.
on what terminology is. I've seen people who are professing to be trance mediums. Who are trance mediums professing to be direct voice mediums because they misunderstand the terminology.
Oh,
And I've seen people professing to be physical mediums who also misunderstand the terminology,
right.
that them being physically alive and being the medium does not make them a physical medium.
Oh,
If
yeah,
that's
that's
the
what they
case,
think it means. Okay.
if that's the case, then then I'm a very good one, because there's a lot of
Right.
me.
No,
But
it's very important to establish what we're talking about here.
yes, and physical mediumship is probably, I think it was once described as the jewel in the crown of mediumship, of spiritualism, from where
Right.
most mediumship becomes famous. But obviously, mediumship is alive and vibrant without spiritualism. Mediumship is alive in its own right, and physical mediumship is the most fascinating, probably the most evidential source of mediumship you're going to find. And I imagine when I got to the stage where you, on your natural progression, on your journey of research and discovery, are inching closer to physical mediumship. When I'm reading it,
Yeah.
I almost got the impression of you, uh, I, probably like I did, and anybody else who sat with a genuine physical medium. You're walking to the front door of that first, going, oh my God, I've read about it. I'm now going to hopefully experience it. Now, I know
Right.
Indraji produced wonderful physical mediumship, because he was from that period where we seem to be capable of producing it
Right.
in incredible abundance. But what was your first introduction to physical mediumship?
You mean in terms of my experientially or
Yes, for your own
yeah.
research aspects, because you've
I
obviously read about it, and now
Yeah,
you've
I mean,
got to
I
go looking
studied it a
for it.
lot, and then I got to go and sit with Stuart Alexander.
And
And it was
okay,
so incredible because I had studied a lot about it and I had read his book and everything, and I was deeply fascinated. I mean, like you, I think pretty much of all of the stuff I've studied, physical mediumship is the most tantalizing
yeah,
and the most mysterious, and the most interesting to me, really, because it's just so unbelievable. And I carefully took the reader in the book through a stage of progression because I know that that's the hardest thing for people to deal with, is the fact
yes,
that this is actually a real thing. So
yes,
I wanted to make sure I kind of got them ready for that. That's why I dealt with it at the end. And that's why I also dealt with documented cases, historical cases, such as the case of Frana Kluski and Eusapia Palladino and other
yes,
people who have been studied by scientists and so thoroughly documented that what they've done is irrefutable. So I
yes,
kind of wanted to make sure that everybody kind of got that. And then I was able to move into my own experience with Stuart Alexander, which was just phenomenal. I mean, I think I had maybe 4 sittings with him during the time that I was writing the book. So I was able to include that. I mean, I have a whole chapter in my book describing my own experiences with Stuart. And then I invited him to write the concluding chapter for the book. So he himself, in his own words, tells the story in the very final chapter about how he became, his own mediumship, and just writes a beautiful piece about what it means to him. And, uh, you know, anyway, people have to read that. But it
yeah,
was just great to have Stewart's own voice in the book. He says a lot of things that as a journalist I can't really say. He can deal with much more about why he believes that survival is real and what the mediumship has meant to him and things like that. But it was, talk about life changing. I mean, it was just, and I know you sat with Stuart Alexander, so you've
a number of,
experienced some of the same things.
a number of times.
Yeah, and to actually go in and have that experience was just beyond
I think
my wildest dreams.
I think I always said one of the most amazing things I witnessed. I don't know if you were there, but we attended. You'd lectured at his seminar in the north of England, and it was at a time Stuart had to have spinal surgery, and it was just leading up to that. And Stuart had taken the decision to step back from physical mediumship, but he was going to do trance demonstrations.
Right.
So this gave Frida, who is obviously the communicator who deals with reuniting loved ones through stream. I sat with tears in my eyes because I couldn't fully take on board the reality that was opening up to me in during that demonstration, which was April 2015, if I remember right, and I couldn't. Even as a developing medium myself, and even though I've sat with many mediums down the years for my own research and personal wants, I couldn't quite take on board the gravitas of what was taking place, because what happened with us, you see, was that myself and two members of my circle came, and one of my circle members' mother had died just 5 days before we went to the seminar. And at the seminar, she was the first person to get called up. And her whole family, well, her father, her niece, came through Stuart and spoke through his vocal cords to let them know that her mother had landed. And how, and on top of which, the niece came through and started asking how Tim and Emily was. Well, that was her husband and daughter that she'd left behind when she passed, who was still here. And with that, I started to realize. But then I think one thing I saw there, and I think it was at that particular seminar, was, and it's the only time I've seen it, was a transfiguration attempt over Stuart's face, and the gentleman with the beard. But
I was there for that. That was Ernie with the white beard.
With the white beard, and that happened in daylight.
Yeah, I could see that because I was in the front row. I don't think a lot of people could further back, but I definitely saw that white beard on Stuart's face.
I was at the very, very back, and you could make it out enough to realize what had happened. And it made you appreciate that a closer view would have been better. But it was the fact that this big beard, a sheet of mist came up as I saw it from a distance, and then this face came out. And everybody present, would have been, just depending on where you were sat and how far back. But if everybody could have been sat in the same place, everybody would have saw that with clarity. And I think that was one of the greatest things I've seen, because I would say that finally, in good light, I saw it, and no one can ever take that away,
Right, and that was, of course, with the red light on, so you could actually see. It wasn't in the dark. So and I've seen some of that close up in the actual seance room too. With
Wonderful.
Stuart. Yeah, so I mean, but that was very dramatic with that beard.
Yes,
I remember that very well.
And what about Kai? You had sittings with Kai in Germany, didn't you?
I did. I mean, they were more. I went with Stephen Browdy, who's been studying Kai for years, and it was more to try to film actual physical manifestations. They weren't so much spirit communications as they were just basic physical phenomena. I mean, we were focusing on the table tilting, table tilting, and table, which is in the world of physical mediumship. It's pretty basic. I mean, people can do that without even going into trance or without being connected to spirit.
Yeah.
So I mean, Kai wasn't really in trance. He sort of goes into a semi-trance. So so I was able to write in the book about documented stuff that occurred in that with him, but it not at the same level Stuart in that situation, because again, we were just focused on trying to film, and Kai was very nervous about having cameras in there, which so many mediums are.
Yeah.
So that was just something, it was part of a team effort that I was invited to participate in. And I wasn't in charge of that, but we did. I mean, I witnessed physical phenomena in that room that, like the banging of a drum and, bells ringing and things like that, where Kai was under complete control on
Yes.
both sides. And there's no way that anybody in the room did those things. But that's pretty, basic stuff. I mean, Stuart goes way beyond. I mean, the thing that was the most meaningful to me in sitting with Stuart, and this wasn't at Cobra, but in a small group with the home circle, was the materialization of the hand that Walter's been doing. Walter is one of Stuart's communicators who is in charge of the physical manifestation of stuff. And he has been doing this, of course, for a long time. Lots of people have experienced it.
Yeah.
But so I had read about it, and I remember hoping that it might happen when I was there, but I had no idea, because you never know with a seance if it's what's going to happen.
No, it's Stuart's last seance. The power wasn't there for Walter to do the hand experiment during the October one. I think it's the first time I've not known it be done, but unfortunately, but for whatever reason, it couldn't be done on that occasion because the power wasn't there. We'll never understand that either. I don't think the power. What is that power they use?
They can't even explain it. I mean, they're talking now about conserving energy for Cobra. I mean, it's very important to them to do what they can do at Cobra Hill, but it may be hard. It's harder for them to work in a big group.
Yes.
I've heard them explain that. It's harder for them when there's a large group, because there's so many different energies in the room.
Yeah.
And I think they feel, and they're supposed to perform. It's a funny thing, but I've been fortunate enough to experience that hand, with the home circle and with just a few people present, and it's just absolutely wonderful to.
It absolutely is. I agree.
Touch it and watch it, because that's in the red light also, so you can actually see the hand form from a massive ectoplasm into a physical hand that moves and feels just like a human hand.
Yeah, many people have shook hands with Walter down the years.
Yeah,
I believe you were lucky. You've been lucky enough too.
More than once. And he said, "Would you like to shake the hand of a man who's been dead to your world for 100 years?" He asked me that.
You said, "No, thanks."
No, thanks, I'll pass. Maybe next time.
Who you gonna call?
Yeah.
I mean, I joke, but I joke in all good humor, because it is an amazing experience. I mean,
it is.
my own mediumship was touched massively by Stuart and Walter back at the start. Without, I think, Walter's words, it may not have gone the way it did. And I think it's worth noting for people, just as a sideline to this, there is an interview or a discussion I gave with Kathy, who runs the group, where I did a presentation on two mediums, and one of those I discussed was Minna Crandon, known to the world as Marjorie, and Walter Stinson was working through his sister Marjorie, Minna, her real name, and was investigated by Houdini and other Scientific America and everything back in the 20s, 30s, and it is the same Walter now who has continued to work through Stuart Alexander for at least the last probably 15, 20 years at least. So it's ever so fascinating.
He's wonderful, and he has a great sense of humor. And I just let people know that on my website I have an excellent video of a talk that Stuart gave, actually, in Zwijnhof. Is that how you say it? In
Zwijnhof, yes.
Yeah, it was very recent, and it's a very high quality thing, and people can go on and watch that video if they want. And Stuart talks all about his development as a medium and who the communicators are that speak through him and all of that. And I highly recommend it, because he's a wonderful speaker.
Yes.
So my website is survivingdeathkean.com. It's the name of the book and my last name, which is Kean, survivingdeathkean.com. So people go on there, they'll see that video there.
Well, I'll be sure to put on this video when we release it within the group, and when we put it out on YouTube as well. I'll be sure to include the links as well, so that people can easily find their way to you.
That'd be great.
And all I can say is to urge people to go out and buy this book, folks. I've put the pictures up before for everybody and the links, but I think it's important if we have a background on the book so that you can really see the in-depth effort that has been put into producing this work. I suppose I want to round everything up, Leslie. I want to find a
Mm-hmm.
way of doing that. And I think, I suppose physical mediumship has to be the jewel in the crown. It has to be the game changer at the end of it. You're now, what is it, 2 years since this book came out now? It's got to be 2 years at
Yeah,
least.
it's been 1 year actually, because
Oh,
the
is it?
paperback just came out. Yeah, so it came out last year in March.
There you go.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you're now a year down the line,
yeah.
and probably further because the book would have been in production for a
It was
period
in
of time.
production for like 9 months or something. Yeah, it takes a long time. Yeah.
So can you perhaps, to expand out and suppose in a finalizing manner, how has this changed things for you now? As a person, you've took all this data, and as a human, we take it on board, and we then sit back and look at it, and you have your own work, your own investigation, all of these accounts. You're
Yeah.
now that far down the line since the book has been done, so no doubt further information will have drifted towards you in that time that you will have shared in various
Yeah.
ways. So how does it change things for you, perhaps not so much in a journalistic way, but in a personal way? How does it touch you as
Yeah.
an individual? Where does it leave you as a person?
It really does change me. And just to say, Warren, that, the journey of writing this book was not only research, because
Mm.
I had a lot of my own experiences along the way, and
Yeah,
I do include those in the book. And after death communications that were very physical from my brother, and voices and seeing apparitions and things like that. So
yes,
there's a lot of experience. So for me, the journey was very personal as well as intellectual. And yeah, it's completely changed me. I mean, uh, that's what I love about this material. Unlike UFOs, right, which I studied for so long, I never saw one, and I don't
yeah,
have a choice about seeing one. I had to rely on everybody else. But with this world, you can jump into in it yourself,
yeah,
and sit with mediums, and do various things that might encourage you to have your own experiences. So that was a big part of it for me. And it just expands your mind. It makes it it certainly helped me cope with the loss of my brother, who died actually during the time when I was writing the book, very unexpectedly. And it was really tragic. And that was it was just very, so I know that it's helpful in that way. But for me, it's funny. I feel like the more I learn, the more questions it opens up, the more mystery there is.
yeah,
Um, and so it's just a huge mystery to me. And there's no real resolution yet, that's definitive.
yeah,
So, but I find that to be very stimulating and expanding, and it really just opens up my mind, and it's very, wonderful for me to understand this evidence so well,
yeah,
which to me highly, highly suggests that we do survive death in some form or other. And of course, we all, that's a comfort, because I can't prove that,
no,
but obviously, but there's so much compelling evidence. So it was very satisfying to me to discover that.
yeah,
The more that I studied, the more I became convinced about that.
yeah,
And so, but I also feel like there's a lot more I want to learn. Um, the journey hasn't ended for me at all. And there's a
no.
lot more, particularly around physical mediumship, that I want to study and try to understand more about how this actually happens and what is going on, and sometimes even the spirit people can't explain it.
It's true. I've experienced that myself. Where they struggle to answer how they do things.
I mean, like a book
Um,
test, for instance. Frida did a book test for me. It was
yes,
just amazing. It was this exact line, a specific word, specific page, and specific line down from the page in a book on my shelf, and she's never been here before. Neither has Stuart. And I asked her, "How do you do this?" She said, "I don't really know. She can't explain it."
Oh, it's wonderful, isn't
And
it?
when she tries and gets it wrong, which has happened to me also, she's had many where she's failed. She doesn't understand that either. Why she's accurate sometimes and not other times.
Yeah,
So I don't think we're going to ever get real answers to a lot of this, but I think for me, living in a state of mystery and inquisitiveness about these kinds of things means a lot to me. It
yes.
just, it's kind of what fuels my life. And so I don't know if it's hard to explain the personal effect, but it definitely was a very, very personal journey for me. And I think that comes through in the book. I'm
Oh, yeah.
trying to sort of blend my own personal experience with the study and with the journalistic approach to data and
Yeah.
stories, and evidence, it's not dry at all. I don't want people to think it's dry, but it's evidential. And so when you
Yes.
put all that together and you have your own experiences, it's powerful. I still sometimes get moments of doubt. Um, I mean, I think maybe everyone does. I don't know if that's true or not. With all that I know and all the experiences I've had and holding Walter's hand and all of that, I still sometimes doubt because I think we've been so brainwashed and so taught,
Yes.
that these things aren't real and that, when the brain dies, that's the end and all of that. It's very hard to sort of move beyond that for some of us anyway, for me. But I find it an absolutely wonderful journey, and I feel like I've almost just begun, really. So
And it's I think you're quite right, and it's definitely, without doubt, been fantastic to sit with you today and share
oh, thank
in
you,
some of
Walter.
that journey. Really good, and to get the whole details, to have read the whole story in the book as well. This, for those who will go on to read it, those who have read it, it really seals it, and it gives people something to connect to. And your
Yeah,
story is fantastic. It's been a great journey that I'm sure, without any shadow of a doubt, will continue onwards. With
yeah.
a lot more to discover.
I think it's a good book to give to skeptics. If somebody's
Yes.
had their own experiences and they're convinced and they have a friend who says, oh, come on, this is impossible. This is the kind of information that is so well documented that it's convincing to skeptics. I've had a lot of them write me and say, I
Yes.
never believed in this stuff before, but you've really changed my perspective.
You only have to look on Amazon to see that in the review section.
Yeah, it's true. It's
There's
very good
plenty.
in that way.
It's
And
been.
I love for people too to see that there's a lot of photographs in the book, and one among them are photographs of these hands, that materialized hands that
The
that appeared, yeah, in the seance room of Frank Kluski. We don't have time to go into it, but they were molds that were made. The materialized hands dipped themselves in hot wax, and from the waxed gloves, they were able to make plaster molds of actual spirit hands.
Yes.
And those are, and I have all these photographs in the book and the story of how these were made and everything. And they exist, they're in safe keeping in France in an institute there. So, those are the kinds of things that you just can't argue with.
Yeah.
We have proof that these hands actually materialized.
Yes.
And the story, the papers that were written about how that happened and how tight the controls were and how astute the scientists were that did the studies with
Yeah.
this medium and, secluding him in a room that they had control over with no windows and blah, blah, blah. There's just no way that anybody can say that didn't happen.
Exactly. And
And it's
it's quite
powerful.
quite impossible to make wax where the fingers are crossed over without breaking it.
Exactly.
It's the fact that they dematerialized their hands, that they had that ability to for the ectoplasm to retreat in the fashion that it does, that makes a hand mold in that gesture possible.
That's the only way that the hand could extract without breaking the mold, would be to
Yeah.
dematerialize. There's no seams or anything on these gloves that were formed, and there's no way that because they have a narrow wrist, that a hand could come out of them. And yeah, when they're like this, forget it.
Yes.
And some of them also were child size, which is so interesting. They were like perfect hands of an adult, but they were small, like a
Yes.
child size, and there were no children in the room. I mean, they were just the scientific investigators and a couple of other people and the medium.
Yeah.
So, it's just really, really incredible evidence. at least for the reality of materialization. So what we, the big question is, are these dead people that are materializing? How does it happen?
Yes.
What is this ectoplasm? How do they create these? How do they use it? And those are the questions that I'm so fascinated by that are probably never going to be answered.
No,
But
it's very possible.
but the fact that these things exist is beyond question. These things have happened, and they continue to happen with Stewart, and I'm sure other people.
Yeah.
And nobody can deny that, as much as they might want to. So I want people to know, and I think Walter was so supportive of my process in writing this book, because he also wants the world to know that we survive death. And he wants that message to get out. And the fact that Stewart is part of this book is just an honor for me, that I was able to sit with him. I was able to write about that, and then he was able to write his own chapter. So, and I encourage the people watching who are not familiar with Stewart's mediumship. There's to read Stewart's own book about his development, Extraordinary
Yes.
Journey. And then there were 3 little books written by Katie Halliwell,
Yes.
Katie Halliwell, who sat with Stewart for probably 10 years and documented and draw pictures and documented everything that went on in the seance room. They're really great to give people an idea of what goes on. So
Wonderful.
Yeah. So thank you
I,
very much, Warren. I look forward to seeing you at Cover Hill.
and you too, Leslie. I'll see you in April. And
Yeah.
I think Stuart concluded your book, and I think the subject matter of his mediumship as easily concludes this chat today, which we'll share with the group. But I am just going to do it again one more time. That this is the hardback. It is now out in paperback. This is Leslie's book, Surviving Death: A Journalist Investigates Evidence for an Afterlife. And she certainly investigates evidence for an afterlife without question.
And the paperback is less expensive and has a brand new cover. So
there you go.
Don't think you have the wrong book and it is out in audio. And actually, I was the one that did the audio, so I was happy they let me do it myself.
It was great because a friend of ours struggles with his sight, so he was able to sit and enjoy hearing you tell the story, and it was wonderful. And I think your work is fantastic, Leslie.
Thank you, Warren.
I think this is the first book in a long time to challenge Arthur Findlay's on the edge of the etheric, or at least to be up there with it, supporting it from a modern standpoint. And I think along with the books that were wrote by the Skull Group and such like, it's up there with them. So it's fantastic. I would urge everybody to definitely go out and get their copies of that. Science and true data and research and evidence is everything. It's not the be all and end all, perhaps, if you are the medium who's developing, one step at a time. But once you get to a certain point, as a physical medium or even as a deep trance medium, it's so vital. So it just leaves me to say, Leslie, of course, I'll see you next month, but for everybody else, for the benefit of everybody else, we have to do that thing where we have to pretend to be interviewers and stuff like that now. I have to pretend to take my job serious, but I'll thank you on behalf of Kathy and Nikki, who are also, Kathy runs this group, and Nikki and I are assistants and admin. But thank you on behalf of everybody for spending the time with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Warren. And thank you for all the great work you do in getting the word out by doing these interviews and, developing yourself. And I have great respect for what you're doing. So
thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to you too. And folks, this video, share it far and wide. And I'll bid you all a goodbye. Take care. Thanks, Leslie.
Bye.